The first time my neighbor accused me of sabotaging his internet, he was standing on my porch in pajama pants holding a 3-ring binder like he was about to present evidence in a murder trial. I'm not exaggerating either. The guy had tabs. Color-coded tabs. "You think this is funny?" he snapped before I even had a chance to say hello. And honestly, for about 3 seconds, I did think it was funny, because there was no universe where I expected a middle-aged man in suburban Arizona to accuse me of launching some kind of Wi-Fi attack from my guest bedroom office. But then I saw his face. Red. Sweaty. Eyes twitching a little. This man wasn't joking. His name was Dennis Hallbrook, retired property claims investigator, lived directly across from me in a gated HOA community called Copper Creek Estates. One of those places where everybody pretends to smile while secretly reporting each other for mailbox violations. I'd moved there less than a year earlier after landing a remote cybersecurity contract that finally let me buy my first decent house. And from the moment Dennis saw me unloading dual monitor setups and networking equipment from my truck, I could feel this weird energy from him. Not open hostility exactly. More like irritation disguised as politeness. "That's a lot of electronics," he'd muttered the day I moved in. At the time, I laughed it off. Looking back, that was probably the beginning. See, Dennis belonged to that generation of guys who measured worth through stability. Same house for 30 years, same barber, same diner every Friday morning. Then people like me started moving into the neighborhood. Younger remote workers renovating old homes, upgrading things, changing the feel of the block. And I think to guys like Dennis it felt personal, like the world was replacing them in real time. Still, none of that explained why he was currently standing on my porch accusing me of destroying his internet connection. "Every night around 7:30, he said, flipping open the binder dramatically, "my signal crashes the second your office lights turn on." I remember blinking at him slowly because I genuinely thought I had missed a joke somewhere. "Dennis," I said carefully, "that's not really how Wi-Fi works." Big mistake. The second I said that, his whole posture changed. You ever notice how some people don't get angry because you disagree with them? They get angry because you made them feel stupid? That's exactly what happened. "Don't talk down to me," he snapped, stepping closer. "I spent 20 years investigating fraud claims. I know patterns when I see them." Then he jabbed a finger toward my house. "Ever since you installed that commercial-grade router, my connection drops every night, and last week I lost a financial meeting because of it." Commercial-grade router. The thing sitting in my office was literally a mid-range Asus router from Best Buy. But in Dennis's mind, it may as well have been Pentagon hardware. I tried keeping things calm. "Signals can overlap," I explained, "but one normal home router doesn't just kill another person's internet." He shook his head immediately like he'd already decided reality wasn't invited into this conversation. Funny how it only started after you moved in. And there it was. The real issue. Not the Wi-Fi. Me. I think Dennis had been waiting for a reason to blame me for something since the day I arrived. A month earlier, he'd complained to the HOA because my garbage bin stayed visible too long after pickup. Then he filed another complaint over my garage lights being too bright after dark. One time, he even stopped me while I was mowing my lawn just to explain that younger homeowners rush improvements without respecting neighborhood character, which is HOA language for, "You're changing things and I don't like it." The crazy part is, I actually tried to get along with him at first. Brought over bourbon during Christmas. Helped him move a water heater once. Sat through 45 minutes of fishing stories in his garage while he drank light beer and complained about California ruining Arizona. But people like Dennis treat kindness like surrender. The more patient you are, the more convinced they become they can dominate you. "You owe me compensation," he said finally, voice low and sharp. $1,800 for lost consulting hours. I actually laughed out loud at that point, which turned out to be another mistake. His jaw tightened instantly. "You think I won't escalate this?" "Escalate what?" I asked. "Your microwave conspiracy?" He stared at me for a long second, breathing hard through his nose. Then he said something I still remember word for word. "People like you always hide behind technical jargon until somebody forces accountability. People like you." Yeah, that landed exactly how you think it landed. Then he turned and walked off my porch without another word, binder tucked under his arm, like a man marching into battle. I stood there under the porch light listening to his screen door slam across the street, thinking the whole thing would cool off in a few days. I figured eventually embarrassment would catch up to him and life would move on. What I didn't know yet was that Dennis had already filed a formal interference complaint with our internet provider before he ever knocked on my door. Now, before I keep going, this is the part a lot of people don't understand about HOA neighborhoods and disputes between neighbors, because once somebody files an official complaint, even a ridiculous one, the situation changes completely. According to standard procedure, utility providers actually do have to investigate interference claims if a customer insists there's signal disruption, especially if they start using words like unauthorized equipment or network tampering. Doesn't matter if the accusation sounds insane. Companies document everything because liability scares corporations more than common sense ever will. And from a legal perspective, this is where people accidentally get themselves into trouble. See, Dennis probably thought he was just making a report. What he didn't realize was that once you formally accuse someone of causing interference, especially if money damages are involved, you create a paper trail. Emails, technician notes, service logs, timestamps. Suddenly your emotional outburst becomes documented evidence. That's why neighborhood disputes spiral so fast in HOA communities. People stop talking like neighbors and start talking like amateur attorneys. But honestly, the legal side wasn't even the most interesting part to me. The psychology was. This is a psychological trap I've seen happen over and over, especially with older homeowners who feel like their environment is changing faster than they can control. Something frustrating happens: bad internet, noisy dogs, parking issues, property values shifting, and instead of accepting randomness, the brain searches for a target. Usually the newest person, the youngest person, the outsider. Once Dennis convinced himself I was the problem, every little coincidence became proof. My office light turns on. Internet drops. I buy a new router? Must be suspicious. That's confirmation bias mixed with pride, and man, that combination can turn perfectly normal people into neighborhood supervillains real quick. The lesson here is that most community conflicts aren't really about the thing people are screaming about. They're about control, fear, ego, loneliness. All the messy emotional stuff nobody wants to admit out loud. And trust me, once the internet company technician finally showed up at our neighborhood 3 days later, all of that started surfacing fast. The technician arrived on a Thursday evening right around sunset, when the whole neighborhood had that calm suburban look people fake on real estate brochures, sprinklers clicking across green lawns, kids riding scooters in cul-de-sacs, somebody grilling burgers 2 houses down. And standing dead center in his driveway, like a man waiting for federal agents to raid a compound, was Dennis. Arms crossed, binder tucked under one arm. Watching the service van roll in like Christmas morning had finally arrived. The technician introduced himself as Eric, early 30s maybe, tired eyes, work boots, carried himself with the exact energy of a guy who had spent years dealing with people who believed Facebook posts more than trained professionals. The second he stepped out of the van, Dennis pointed toward my house and said, "That's where the interference is coming from." No hello, no context, just accusation. Eric glanced over at me, and I swear there was this tiny flicker in his face like, oh boy, one of these situations. We started at my house first. Dennis followed us inside so closely you would have thought he was supervising a criminal investigation. The outages happened mostly at night, he kept repeating while Eric unpacked equipment at my kitchen counter. Ever since he upgraded his system. The way Dennis described my setup, you'd think I was operating a CIA surveillance hub out of a guest bedroom instead of answering Zoom calls in sweatpants. Eric plugged into my network, scanned channels, checked signal strength, interference levels, modem logs, and within maybe 5 minutes he leaned back slightly and said, "Everything here looks normal." Dennis immediately shook his head. No, that can't be right." Eric stayed calm. "Your neighbor's router is operating within standard residential ranges." "Check again," Dennis snapped. "It spikes at night." That's when Eric said the sentence that changed the entire atmosphere. "Okay," he replied casually. "Let's look at your equipment." Tiny pause. Tiny hesitation. I saw it immediately. Dennis forced this weird half-smile and nodded too quickly. "Sure. Yeah. Fine." We walked across the street together while nearby curtains mysteriously shifted in multiple windows because nothing activates suburban neighborhoods faster than visible conflict. Dennis opened his front door, and suddenly the entire tone of the evening changed. His house felt frozen somehow. Not dirty exactly, but stuck in time. Heavy curtains shut out most of the light. Old magazines stacked beside recliners. Framed family photos covered the walls. Fishing trips, graduation pictures, Christmas mornings from years ago. The kind of photos people leave up long after the people inside them stop visiting. And for the first time since this whole thing started, Dennis didn't feel intimidating. He felt lonely. Eric followed the cable line into the den where Dennis had his computer set up. Then he stopped walking. Huh. Just that one word. But you could feel the shift instantly. Dennis stiffened. What? Eric crouched near a massive metal filing cabinet shoved tightly against the wall. Behind it, crammed into maybe 6 inches of dusty space, sat Dennis's router. And right beside it was an ancient microwave sitting on a rolling utility cart, the kind with yellowed plastic buttons from the early 2000s. Even worse, the coax cable attached to the modem looked absolutely destroyed. Corrosion around the connectors. Frayed insulation. Rust flaking onto the carpet underneath. Eric touched the cable gently, and tiny metal particles literally crumbled off in his fingers. He looked up slowly. Sir, how long has this setup been here? Dennis crossed his arms defensively. Years. What? Eric pointed toward the microwave. And you use that every evening? Yeah, around dinner. Eric nodded once. That's your problem. The silence afterward was unbelievable. Dennis blinked hard. Excuse me. Eric explained it calmly, like he'd done this 100 times before. Older microwaves with failing shielding can leak interference, especially around 2.4 gigahertz frequencies. Put a router beside one, trap both behind a giant metal cabinet, then add damaged coax degrading the incoming signal. And congratulations, you've basically engineered your own internet apocalypse. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard trying not to laugh that I tasted blood. But Dennis wasn't ready to surrender reality yet. That doesn't explain why it started after he moved in, he argued. Eric sighed softly, opened his tablet, and compared outage timestamps against signal interruptions. Then he asked Dennis one question. What time do you usually make dinner? Dennis frowned. Around 7:30. Eric turned the screen around. Every outage matched microwave activity almost exactly. 7:32. 7:36. 7:41. Day after day after day. You could physically watch the fight leave Dennis's body while he stared at those timestamps. His shoulders dropped first. Then his jaw loosened. Then came the worst part. The realization that he'd spent weeks building an entire case against me over something happening inside his own house. But Eric wasn't finished. He started taking photos. Router placement. Cable damage. Interference readings. Dennis looked up quickly. Why are you documenting that? Eric answered without even looking at him. According to standard procedure, formal interference complaints require full documentation. There it was again. Official language. The kind that suddenly makes people realize they're no longer just arguing emotionally. They've entered a system that keeps records. Dennis shifted uncomfortably. So what happens now? Eric kept typing. Your neighbor's equipment is compliant, so there's no provider violation. Then he added, very matter-of-factly, you'll most likely be billed for the service visit since the issue originated from customer-owned equipment. Dennis went pale, but Eric still wasn't done. And repeated false interference claims can lead to penalties or restricted support priority. That line hit like a shotgun blast in a quiet room. Dennis finally looked over at me then, and honestly, I expected anger. Maybe another accusation. Instead, I saw embarrassment. Pure embarrassment. The kind that hollows somebody out from the inside because they suddenly realize other people can see the thing they were trying desperately to hide. Fear, confusion, pride. I looked around that room again. The untouched recliner, the dusty family photos, the unopened mail stacked beside the lamp. And something shifted in me too. Because suddenly this wasn't just some cranky HOA villain trying to ruin my week. This was a man losing control of his world one small inconvenience at a time, grabbing onto the nearest explanation that made him feel less powerless. Didn't excuse it, but it explained it. Eric finished packing his equipment and headed for the door. Dennis didn't follow. He just stood there staring at the router like it had betrayed him personally. Before leaving, Eric handed him a printed summary sheet with repair recommendations. Replace coax line. Relocate router. Replace microwave shielding unit if interference persists. Totally fixable problems. Dennis took the paper slowly without saying a word. I started toward the door too, then paused beside him. Dennis, I said quietly, you could have just asked me for help. He laughed once under his breath. Not happy, not angry, just tired. Yeah, he muttered. Maybe. Then he looked away. That was probably the strangest part of the entire situation. There was no big screaming match at the end. No cinematic revenge speech. Just two exhausted men standing in a dim room realizing the argument had never really been about internet signals in the first place. But the story still wasn't over. Because about a week later, the bill from the provider finally arrived, and that's when the entire neighborhood found out what happened. A week later, I was grabbing mail when I saw Dennis standing at the community mailbox station, holding an envelope from the provider with both hands like it contained a medical diagnosis. He opened it slowly right there under the afternoon sun, scanned the page once, then again, and even from 20 feet away, I could see the color drain from his face. He crumpled the corners slightly before catching himself, probably realizing a few neighbors were already pretending not to watch. And man, if you've ever lived in an HOA neighborhood, you already know. People treat community drama like live sports. Within days, the story spread through Copper Creek estates in fragments. Some people heard Dennis accused me of hacking his Wi-Fi. Others heard the microwave exploded, which absolutely never happened, but somehow became neighborhood canon anyway. One older couple told me they'd always suspected electromagnetic problems in the subdivision, which honestly explained a lot about HOA meetings. But the weirdest part? The reactions split almost perfectly down the middle. Some neighbors thought the whole thing was hilarious. Serves him right. One guy whispered to me during trash pickup, "Dennis reports everybody." But others thought I should have handled it differently once I realized he was lonely and embarrassed. One woman actually told me, "You younger people don't understand how fast technology leaves some folks behind." And honestly, that stuck with me more than I expected. Because from a legal perspective, Dennis absolutely crossed lines. Filing false complaints, demanding compensation, escalating a personal grudge into formal reports. That stuff can spiral into real consequences fast. According to standard procedure, utility companies document every interaction because neighbor disputes sometimes evolve into lawsuits, harassment claims, even property conflicts. People think they're just venting frustration, but once paperwork starts, emotions become evidence. That's the dangerous part. But emotionally, psychologically, the story feels messier than simple right versus wrong. This is a psychological trap communities fall into constantly now, especially in neighborhoods where generations collide. Older residents feel replaced. Younger residents feel judged. Technology becomes a symbol for deeper fears nobody knows how to talk about directly. Dennis wasn't really fighting my router. He was fighting the feeling that the world had stopped making sense to him. And if we're being honest, a lot of people are dealing with that exact fear right now. They just express it in different ways. Some people yell at customer service workers. Some start Facebook wars in HOA groups. Some convince themselves their neighbor is secretly destroying their internet connection because admitting, "I don't understand what's happening anymore," feels too vulnerable. The lesson here is that pride can turn confusion into conflict unbelievably fast, especially when someone feels isolated, embarrassed, or left behind. But there's another lesson too. Empathy doesn't mean accepting bad behavior. You can understand why someone acts irrationally without letting them bully you. That distinction matters a lot. Dennis and I never really spoke again after that. If we passed each other walking to the mailboxes, he'd nod slightly at most. No apology, no final conversation. Just this quiet mutual understanding that the entire disaster had gone way too far. A few months later, I noticed he'd replaced the microwave and moved the router into another room. Internet problems magically disappeared after that. Funny how that works. Still, sometimes I think about that night standing in his living room looking at all those old family pictures on the walls, and I wonder how many neighborhood wars actually begin with loneliness instead of hatred. How many people are really just terrified of becoming irrelevant in a world moving faster every year? And honestly, I think that's why this story hit such a nerve with people online when I first shared it. Because everybody knows a Dennis. Maybe it's a neighbor. Maybe it's a parent. Maybe, if we're honest with ourselves, maybe some part of us has been Dennis before too, blaming the nearest person for frustrations we didn't fully understand. So now I genuinely want to hear your take on this situation. Was I right to let the investigation play out and protect myself legally? Or should I have tried harder to help him before everything escalated? And where's the line between understanding someone's pain and excusing behavior that hurts other people? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because these neighborhood conflict stories always divide people hard. And if you've ever had an HOA dispute or a neighbor accusation spiral completely out of control, I'd love to hear your story too.